England, late 15th century, a kingdom bleeding from within. For more than 30 years, two royal houses, York and Lancaster, tore the realm apart in a grinding, merciless struggle for the crown. Historians would later call it the Wars of the Roses. Those who lived through it called it something simpler. They called it survival. White rose against red, cousin against cousin. The great lords of England chose their colors and bled for them on frozen fields and muddy river banks, in candle-lit council chambers, and on the cold steps of execution scaffolds. It was into this world that a boy was born at Fotheringay Castle on the 2nd day of October, 1452. The fourth surviving son of Richard, Duke of York, a child of the storm. His name was Richard. What becomes of a boy born into a dynasty at war? He grew into the last Plantagenet King England would ever know. Richard III, a name carrying the full weight of history's judgment for more than 5 centuries. In Shakespeare's plays, he is a scheming villain who murdered children for a throne. In Tudor chronicles, a tyrant draped in dark rumor. And yet, in the north of England, among the commoners who lived beneath his rule, he was something else entirely. He was the man who gave them justice, the man who gave them law. He died on a Leicestershire battlefield, the 22nd of August, 1485, 32 years old. He rode directly toward his enemies in a final cavalry charge. He was cut down, unhorsed, surrounded, the last king of England to die in battle. No monarch has fallen on a battlefield since. In 2012, beneath a Leicester car park, workers found a skeleton, male, slender, with a severe lateral curvature of the spine, multiple blade wounds to the skull. He had not surrendered. DNA confirmed it. The last Plantagenet returned from 5 centuries of darkness. This is his story. The loyal brother who stood at his king's shoulder through exile and war. The northern lord famed for fairness. The protector who reached, instead, for a crown. The king who rewrote the legal foundations of his country before dying alone, abandoned by those he trusted most. What drives a loyal brother to seize a crown never meant to be his? Close your eyes. Let your breathing slow. We begin at the beginning. Suggest topics for new videos in the comments and subscribe to the channel. Sleep stories, sleep, dream are released here every day. He was born into thunder. Not the gentle kind that children watch from warm windows. The thunder greeting Richard's arrival was the kind that splintered ancient oaks and left ground smelling of scorched stone. It was October the 2nd, 1452. England itself was fracturing. The castle walls sheltering Duchess Cecily through her long, difficult labor were the walls of a dynasty already beginning to crack. Fotheringay Castle stood in Northamptonshire, solid and gray and ancient, rising above the flat water meadows of the River Nain. The baby came late in the evening. He was small, the 11th child of Richard, Duke of York, and Cecily Neville, called the Rose of Raby, named Richard after his father. Some said he was born with teeth already formed, though that is almost certainly the invention of men who wished to plant a legend of monstrousness from the first breath. He was born into a world already preparing to wound him. England in 1452 was not a peaceful place. King Henry VI, gentle and pious and entirely unsuited to governance, had lurched his reign toward collapse. Richard's father, the Duke of York, held a claim to the throne many considered stronger than the king's own. The tension between York and Lancaster was already pulling toward the violence that would define the next 30 years. A child born at the center of England's most dangerous quarrel, who would learn before he learned to read. That power was a thing men killed for. Then the world broke open. What happens to a child when his father is killed? When the word arrives not gently, but in the form of soldiers and shouting, and his mother's face going white and rigid with a grief she cannot afford to show, on the 30th of December, 1460, Richard's father was killed at the Battle of Wakefield, ambushed by Lancastrian forces, while his army was still dispersed. His head was placed above the gates of York, wearing a paper crown, a savage mockery of his ambitions. Richard's brother Edmund, the Earl of Rutland, was also killed that day. He was 17, cut down while trying to escape across a bridge by a lord, who looked at a fleeing boy and chose to end it anyway. Richard was 8 years old. His father was dead. His brother was dead. Their heads were on a gate. His mother, Cecily, was a woman of extraordinary composure. She had surviving children to protect, and in the dark weeks after Wakefield, she sent her 2 youngest sons away. George, 11, and Richard, 8, were dispatched across the sea to the court of Philip the Good, Duke of Burgundy, where they would be safer than in an England where their dead father's ambitions had made them targets. Feel what that is. The cold of a sea crossing in winter, in 1461. The gray water, the pitching deck, and the smell of salt and bilge water. 2 boys leaving England without knowing if they would return, without knowing if their mother would be safe at the court of Philip the Good. Richard began the formal education noble boys of his era received, and the physical training that would define the rest of his life. The lance, the sword, the horse. But Burgundy was always temporary. Edward won. His eldest brother, now Duke of York, fought back with ferocity and military gifts that astonished all who witnessed them. By the end of March 1461, he had won the Battle of Toten in a snowstorm so brutal it became its own legend. The House of York controlled England. They could come home. Richard returned in the early summer of 1461. He had been gone less than a year, but the England he returned to was a different country. His brother Edward sat on the throne as King Edward IV. Almost immediately, Richard's education as a Yorkist prince resumed in earnest. He was placed in the household of Richard Neville, the Earl of Warwick, the most powerful magnate in England. Known to history as the Kingmaker, a title earned by his ability to place and displace kings according to his own ambitions. What does a boy learn when raised in the household of the most powerful man in England? He learns that power has a smell, a texture, a set of rules that the powerful understand and the weak do not. He learns to observe and to hold his own counsel. Richard was at Middleham Castle, Warwick's stronghold in the North Riding of Yorkshire, a massive working fortress surrounded by the wild moorland that would become so central to Richard's identity. Here he learned to fight. He trained under experienced knights and men at arms. There is evidence, confirmed by the examination of his recovered skeleton in 2012, that he suffered from adolescent idiopathic scoliosis, a curvature of the spine that developed during his teenage years, almost certainly during this very period. His armor had to be custom-fitted to accommodate his asymmetric torso, and yet he trained hard. he developed a reputation not for the easy grace of his brother Edward, but for something grimmer: persistence, precision, a refusal to let difficulty become an excuse. He also learned, during these years at Middleham, the thing that would shape his character more than almost anything else: loyalty, not abstract loyalty of pledges and ceremonies, but the specific, practiced loyalty of a boy who understood that his family's survival depended on each member holding firm. He had seen what happened when the House of York was weak: a paper crown on a dead man's gate, a brother cut down on a bridge at 17. Richard did not intend to contribute to that weakness. Then the world broke again. Warwick turned. His frustration with Edward's independence, and with Edward's surprise marriage to the widowed Elizabeth Woodville, a choice Warwick had not been consulted about, curdled into open rebellion. In 1469, Warwick declared against the king he had helped place on the throne. Richard was 17. He chose without apparent hesitation his brother's side. George did not. George allied himself with Warwick. His defection was a wound to Edward, and to Richard too, though Richard absorbed it with characteristic inward stillness. Warwick's first rebellion failed. Edward reasserted control, and Warwick fled to France. Within a year he was back, with an alliance that should have been unthinkable. He had allied with Lancastrian Queen Margaret of Anjou, the woman who had been his mortal enemy for years. Together they invaded. In September of 1470 they landed, and this time it was Edward who fled. The Lancastrian king, Henry VI, was put back on the throne, and Edward, taking both brothers with him, sailed for the court of Charles the Bold, Duke of Burgundy, who had married their sister Margaret. Winter refugees waiting. Not for long. By March of 1471, Edward had assembled ships and men and the will to take back his kingdom. He landed at Ravenspur in Yorkshire with a force that began small and grew with every mile marched south. Richard was 18. He commanded the vanguard. This was not a ceremonial honor. The vanguard was the forward division of the army, making first contact with the enemy, requiring nerve, tactical judgment, and the willingness to absorb the opening violence of a battle while holding the line. The most dangerous position, the one that proved whether a young commander had qualities no training yard could teach. Richard proved it at Barnet. On the 14th of April, 1471, the Battle of Barnet was fought in dense morning fog, the kind that makes friends look like enemies and ruins the careful dispositions of armies before the fighting has begun. The armies clashed in the gray mist, and the fog created confusion, miscommunication, and fatal friendly fire. A Lancastrian contingent mistook their own allies for enemies. The result was chaos and then collapse. Richard held his division together through the disorientation, pressing forward steadily, refusing to allow his men to break. And when Warwick's forces crumbled, his vanguard drove the collapse home. Warwick was killed. The man who had raised Richard, who had taught him so much about the nature of power, died on that foggy field. Richard was 18, and he had learned long ago to keep his inner life behind a still face. 3 weeks later, on the 4th of May, 1471, the final engagement of this phase of the wars was fought at Tewkesbury in Gloucestershire. The remaining Lancastrian forces under Queen Margaret of Anjou and the young Edward of Westminster, Henry VI's son and heir, made their stand near the River Severn. Richard commanded the vanguard again. This time there was no fog. The battle was fought in clear daylight, and Richard drove his division hard into the Lancastrian lines. The Lancastrian army broke. Edward of Westminster was killed in the rout. Queen Margaret was captured. With Tewkesbury, the Lancastrian cause was effectively finished for a generation. Richard was 18 years old. He had survived exile twice, trained through a curved spine and the cold winds of Middleham's yards, commanded the most exposed position in two crucial battles, and held his men steady through fog and chaos and the raw violence of medieval combat. At every point when the choice was offered, he had stood with his brother and his house. The wars were not over. But for now they had paused. England was Yorkist again. Edward sat securely on his throne, and Richard, the youngest, the smallest, the one who had watched and never wavered, had earned the right to be trusted. What he would do with that trust, and how it would lead him toward the most fateful decisions of his life, remains still unfolding. For now, close your eyes. The battles are done. The fog has lifted. A young man of 18 rides back toward London in the April light, and the future has not yet shown its face. Rest now. Let the story continue in the soft dark behind your eyelids. The wars had paused. England was Yorkist, and Richard, 18 years old and returning from Tewkesbury, found himself in an unusual position. He was the king's most trusted brother. He had earned that in the fog at Barnet and in the crush at Tewkesbury, and Edward IV, a man not easily moved to sentiment, had noticed. The question now was simpler and stranger than any battle. What came next? The answer did not arrive through ambition. It arrived through circumstance. Anne Neville was 19 years old. She was the younger daughter of Richard Neville, the Earl of Warwick, the kingmaker, the most powerful nobleman in England, the man who had placed Edward IV on the throne and then tried to remove him, who had died at Barnet in April of 1471. Her elder sister, Isabel, had married Richard's brother George, Duke of Clarence. Now Anne stood at the edge of a new world, widowed, young, and heir to half the vast Warwick inheritance. She had been briefly married to Edward of Westminster, the Lancastrian prince, killed at Tewkesbury. A widow at 19 and the heir to an enormous concentration of land across the North and Midlands. What drives a man to pursue a marriage in the quiet aftermath of war? Sometimes strategy, sometimes something less easily named. In Richard's case, likely both at once. George of Clarence had no intention of sharing the Warwick inheritance with his younger brother. The chroniclers record that George concealed Anne in London disguised as a kitchen maid, hidden in a house where Richard could not reach her, trying to make her disappear so that the question of the land would resolve itself in his favor. Richard found her anyway, the determination required to locate a hidden girl in a city of thousands, to insist on bringing her case before the royal council when his own brother stood against him, speaks to something that would define him throughout his life. He did not release what he had decided was his dot. The dispute went before Edward IV and the royal council. Both brothers argued fiercely. In the end, the inheritance was divided. Richard received the northern estates. George kept the southern holdings. Both were granted special acts of Parliament, allowing them to inherit, through their wives as though they were heirs of blood to the kingmaker. Richard and and were married in the spring of 1472. He was 19. She was 19. Whatever the political calculation beneath the union, what followed across the next decade suggests that something warmer took root. They would spend those years together in the north, far from the court, far from London, building something that looked, from the outside, remarkably like a life genuinely chosen. The north of England in the 1470s was a different world from Westminster. It was vast and wind-scoured, divided by moorland and steep limestone dales, governed by local loyalties that had little patience for distant royal authority. The border with Scotland was a permanent wound, raided and fought over in cycles that never fully resolved. Justice, when it came slowly and at great expense. Edward IV had the solution close at hand. He had a brother whose marriage had given him the old Neville affinity and the loyalty of thousands of northern tenants. He had a brother he trusted absolutely. And so, across the early years of the decade, the grants accumulated. Richard was made Lieutenant of the North. He was given authority to raise soldiers, custody of royal castles, and the effective powers of a viceroy north of the River Trent, without ever carrying a single formal title that said so. Plainly, what do you do when you are 20 years old and a king has handed you responsibility for a province that has known nothing but conflict for a generation? You ride into it. You listen. You sit in judgment. The Council of the North had existed in various forms before Richard arrived. What he gave it was regularity, genuine authority, and something the northern commoners had rarely encountered in the hands of the powerful: impartiality. The council allowed men and women who could never afford the journey to London, who could not survive the costs of the common law courts, to bring their disputes to a tribunal that convened within reach. It sat in York, in Durham, in whichever town Richard had ridden to. Cases were heard. Judgments were given. Lords who had bullied their tenants found themselves answering to a court that did not defer to ranked dot. This was not ordinary. The 15th century was not an era of impartial governance. Power protected power. Richard seems to have genuinely resisted this. Contemporary accounts describe his willingness to hear petitions from common people, to intervene when the strong had wronged the weak, to take the complaints of ordinary farmers as seriously as those of lords. Was this altruism? Partly. Richard had trained at Middleham from childhood, grown up alongside northern families, ridden with their sons, learned the dales the way a man learns the rooms of his own house. He was not an outsider visiting with condescension. He was part of it, but practical wisdom also played its role. A governor who dispensed justice earned a loyalty that no conscription could manufacture. When crisis came years later, it would be the North that answered his call most steadily and most fully. The reputation spread through the dales and moorlands. His name became associated with something rare in that era: fairness. It was not a word that attached easily to men of power in 1473, England, but it attached to Richard. The Scottish border was never still. It raided and counter-raided between formal truces and sudden violence. Cattle taken in the night. Farmsteads burned before dawn. Richard approached the border problem as he had approached every challenge since his training. Years, methodically, persistently, with a preference for decisive action over protracted Negotiation. He was involved in border talks as early as 1472. By 1474, he was conducting raids into Scottish territory. The grinding, season-by-season work of holding a contested frontier, of making raids costly enough to deter repetition, of demonstrating to the Scottish crown that the English North was not UNDEFENDED. His soldiers were recruited from the northern counties that had come to know him through years of council sessions. They were not strangers following a distant lord. They were men whose families had received judgments from his court, who had heard from their neighbors that this lord listened. That kind of relationship produced a different quality of commitment on the march. The campaigns were hard. The terrain was brutal and cold. But the border held during Richard's tenure, and by his mid-20s he had become the most militarily capable figure north of the Trent, recognized as such because he had used his authority consistently and without visible hesitation. And always, through all of it, there was Middleham. The castle sat in Wensleydale, in the heart of the Yorkshire dales, surrounded by moorland that changed color with the seasons. Purple in late summer, silver and bare through the long northern winters. Richard had come here first as a child of 8 or 9, placed in the Warwick household to be trained. He had learned to ride in its yards and to handle weapons on its practice grounds. Now he returned to it as its master. He and Anne made Middleham their home. In the rhythm of their years there, something becomes visible that is easy to overlook when Richard is discussed in terms of what came later. He was not a man straining toward a throne. He was a man who had found his place. They had a son, Edward, born likely around 1473. He was reportedly a delicate child, but he was present, and Richard invested in him with the deliberateness of a man who expected the future to unfold in ordinary ways. Young Edward was created Earl of Salisbury. Tutors were arranged. The patient preparation of a father who anticipated watching his son grow into an inheritance. Richard endowed a college of priests at Middleham in 1478. He petitioned for a provincial ecclesiastical college at York, wanting to spare the northern clergy the costly journey to Canterbury. He made grants to churches across the region. These were not conspicuous gestures of a man performing virtue. They were the unremarkable acts of someone engaged in the stewardship of his world. The days were administrative. The evenings were quiet. Correspondence from London was answered. The council issued rulings. Soldiers were paid. The seasons moved through Wensleydale one after another, and the life Richard was living had the texture of something settled and genuinely chosen. He was, in the fullest sense, a lord of the North, not a passing visitor to power, but a man rooted in a landscape known by the people who lived beneath his authority, trusted by the king who had extended it. The court at Westminster was very far away. London was another world. Edward's throne was secure. The Lancastrian cause was extinguished for a generation, and the future had not yet begun to darken at its edges. Close your eyes. The fire in the great hall at Middleham is burned low. The accounts are spread across the table, half read, half answered. Anne has gone up to the rooms above. Somewhere in the castle a child sleeps. Outside, the wind moves through Wensleydale without urgency, and the moorland is still, and the stars are out above the dale. A young man of 24 sits alone in the firelight. The night is long. The future is quiet, and there is nothing tonight that demands he be anything other than exactly who he is. Rest now. The North holds you gently. Let the story wait a little longer in the dark. The fire had burned low at Middleham. The accounts lay on the table, half finished. The wind moved through Wensleydale without urgency. And then the messenger came. He arrived in the early days of April 1483. Riding hard from the south, his horse lathered, his face carrying the particular exhaustion of a man burdened with news too heavy for the road. He asked for the Duke of Gloucester. He was brought to him without delay. King Edward IV was dead. He was 40 years old. He had been ill, but not gravely, not in any way that had prepared the kingdom for what followed. Some said he caught a chill on a fishing excursion along the Thames. Others whispered of decades of excess finally claiming what war had failed to take. Whatever the cause, the effect was absolute. On the 9th of April, 1483, the most powerful Yorkist, King England, had ever known lay down his head and did not rise again. What does a kingdom become in the moment its sovereign dies? It becomes a question without an answer. It becomes a room full of men measuring one another across the silence. And the silence, in April of 1483, was very loud indeed. Edward left 2 sons. The elder, also named Edward, was 12 years old and resided at Ludlow Castle on the Welsh Marsh under the guardianship of his mother's family, the Woodvilles. The younger, Richard of Shrewsbury, was 9, living in London. The succession was clear enough on its surface. Edward V would be king. The kingdom simply needed to get him to his coronation, but nothing in late 15th century England was ever simple on its surface. The Woodvilles were a formidable family. Queen Elizabeth Woodville had spent 20 years placing her brothers and sons from her first marriage in positions of power and profit. They were resented for it by the old nobility, by men who had bled through the wars and watched the Woodvilles rise from relative obscurity to royal adjacency. Richard of Gloucester did not love them. And now, with Edward IV gone, they moved with calculated speed. Anthony Woodville, Earl Rivers, the Queen's brother, was already at Ludlow with the young king. He began organizing Edward's journey to London at once, with an escort large enough to be a statement of intent. The Woodvilles meant to deliver the king to his crowning before any opposition could coalesce. Once Edward V was anointed, with Woodville hands already inside the machinery of government, the question of who truly governed England would answer itself in his will. Edward IV had named Richard of Gloucester Lord Protector of England, guardian of his son until the boy came of age. It was the highest expression of trust one man could place in another. Edward knew his brother. He knew, whatever their occasional disagreements, that Richard was loyal, capable, and free of the calculating self-interest that characterized the court's more dangerous factions. Richard read the letter from the council. He read the terms of his appointment, and then he began to move south. What drives a loyal man to action in the wake of grief? Not ambition, not yet. Something simpler, something more soldierly. A recognition that the moment demands decision, and that delay is itself a form of surrender. He rode south with 300 men in mourning black, weapons sheathed, banners bearing the white boar. He rode as the Lord Protector of England, which was his lawful title, and he had every right to exercise it. He made contact with Henry Stafford, the Duke of Buckingham, who joined him on the road with his own men and with information. The young Edward was traveling from Ludlow in the custody of Earl Rivers. The route would pass through the Midlands. Richard calculated the timing. He knew what the situation required. They met at Stony Stratford in the first days of May 1483. What happened there was swift, quiet, and irreversible. Richard rode out to greet the royal party with courtesy and proper deference, the composed formality of a man entirely in command of himself. He knelt before his nephew. He spoke of his grief at his brother's passing and his determination to serve the young king faithfully. And then, with a smoothness that must have chilled those watching it, he had Anthony Woodville and the other leading members of the escort arrested where they stood. The stated charge was conspiracy against the Lord Protector. Whether this was true in any legally meaningful sense, historians have debated across 5 centuries. What is beyond dispute is the outcome. Rivers and the others were taken north under guard to Yorkshire. The young king was placed in his uncle's care. The Woodville escort was dismissed. The road to London lay open. Queen Elizabeth Woodville, hearing the news, acted immediately. She gathered her younger son, her daughters, and whatever valuables could be moved in hours, and she sought sanctuary at Westminster Abbey. She had been there before, in the dark winters of Edward's first exile. She knew the weight of its protection. She drew her children in after her and waited. Richard entered London on the 4th of May. He was received formally, the young Edward riding beside him. The council confirmed Richard in his role as Lord Protector. The coronation of Edward V was scheduled for the 22nd of June. Richard threw himself into the administrative preparations with the organized efficiency that had characterized his decade in the North. On the surface, he was exactly what his brother had asked him to be. And then came the 13th of June. And then came the executions. What does a man do when he believes there are men in the very room with him who intend his destruction? Richard called a council meeting at the Tower of London. Among those present was Lord William Hastings, the Lord Chamberlain, among the most powerful men in England, and Edward IV's oldest companion. Hastings had initially supported the Protectorate, but intelligence had reached Richard through channels that remain murky even now, that Hastings had been communicating with the Woodvilles, that a faction was forming against him in the weeks before the coronation. The meeting convened in the usual way, and then, with a suddenness that left witnesses struggling to recall the proper sequence of events, Richard had Hastings arrested where he sat. The charge was treason. What followed was no proceeding at all. By afternoon of that same day, William Hastings, Lord Chamberlain of England, was dead, beheaded on Tower Green without benefit of proper trial. His head taken on a makeshift block because there was no proper one ready. Thomas Rotherham, Archbishop of York, and John Morton, Bishop of Ely, were arrested and imprisoned. Others fled. Richard Ratcliffe traveled north, and on the 25th of June, Earl Rivers and the Woodville associates held at Pontefract Castle were executed there. This was the moment. This was the edge over which things began to fall. Violence was not new to Richard's world. Wars, battles, executions after proper defeat. But the killing of Hastings, with its speed and its disregard for legal form, marked something different in quality. It marked the point at which Richard was no longer simply managing a crisis. He was remaking reality to survive one, and the means by which he did so left marks that would not wash clean. He was 30 years old. The summer light fell in long, pale rectangles across the tower's stone floors. Outside, London continued its noise and commerce, indifferent to the specific mechanics of power. Inside, a Lord Protector was becoming something else. The young Edward V, 12 years old and bewildered, was housed in the royal apartments of the tower. These were not a dungeon. They were the traditional lodgings for royalty awaiting coronation, procedure and protocol, and the weight of long tradition. But protocol had been acquiring a particular gravity in recent weeks. In mid-June, Richard moved to bring the younger boy. He sent envoys to Westminster Abbey, insisting that 9-year-old Richard of Shrewsbury must come to the Tower to keep his brother company. The Archbishop of Canterbury himself went to negotiate. The Queen's position was nearly impossible. To refuse was to resist the Lord Protector openly and without legal standing. She relented with what must have been a devastating private anguish, and the boy was taken and carried to join his brother, 2 princes, in the royal apartments of the Tower of London. In the long, warm summer of 1483, the coronation date of the 22nd of June arrived, and passed without ceremony, without a crown, without Edward V. Close your eyes. The tower stands against the night sky, its stones gray and ancient, the river moving past its walls without comment. Inside the royal apartments, 2 boys share a room that kings have slept in before them. The younger is 9, the older is 12. They wait without knowing quite what they are waiting for. The summer moves past the tower windows. The river moves. The city continues its noise around the walls like water, finding its way around stone, in the corridors and council chambers beyond. A world is arranging itself around a question that no one has yet said aloud in public. A question that has been forming since the 9th of April, since the road at Stony Stratford, since the block on Tower Green. Let the night hold it a little longer. Let the question wait in the dark where it has lived for 5.5 centuries. Rest now. Let the story settle into silence. The question had been living in the dark for weeks. And now, in the last days of June 1483, someone finally said it aloud, not in a whisper. In a sermon, Dr. Ralph Shea was a respected theologian, a man of letters and cloth, a preacher of some reputation. On the 22nd of June, 1483, the very day once set aside for the coronation of Edward V, he climbed the outdoor stone pulpit at St. Paul's Cross and spoke to the gathered crowd beneath the open sky. He spoke of legitimacy, of bloodlines, of the sacred, unbreakable laws of God and the English throne. And then he said the thing that changed everything. The marriage of the late King Edward IV to Elizabeth Woodville, he declared, had never been valid. It had been contracted in secret, without the consent of the great lords of England. And before that union, before Edward had ever turned his eye toward the beautiful widow, he had been pre-contracted, secretly betrothed to another woman entirely, to Lady Eleanor Butler, daughter of the Earl of Shrewsbury. A pre-contract under canon law was as binding as marriage itself. If Edward had already been bound to Eleanor Butler, then his subsequent marriage to Elizabeth Woodville was no marriage at all. And if it was no marriage, then the children it produced were no children of the crown. Edward V, Richard of Shrewsbury, Elizabeth of York, all of them illegitimate, bastards under the law of God and man. The crowd at St. Paul's Cross was still. The river wind moved through the churchyard, and somewhere in the royal apartments of the Tower of London, a 12-year-old boy who had been called king for 10 weeks waited in rooms he had never asked to occupy, for a ceremony that would not come. What does it mean to strip a child of a crown he has barely worn? It means that no blood need be spilled. It means the transfer of power can be accomplished not with a sword, but with a sentence, with a sermon, with the right words spoken by the right man on the right morning. Ralph Shaw had spoken them. 3 days later, on the 25th of June, 1483, a carefully assembled petition was presented before Richard at Baynard's Castle, the London home of his mother, Cecily Neville, Duchess of York. The document would later be formally codified as Titulus Regius, meaning the title of the king. It rehearsed the case made at St. Paul's Cross, the pre-contract with Eleanor Butler, the illegitimacy of Edward's children, but it went further. It questioned the legitimacy of George, Duke of Clarence, Richard's elder brother, long dead by attainder, and through these layers of disqualification arrived at a single inevitable conclusion. Of all the sons of Richard, Duke of York, the rightful blood of England ran clear and uncontested in only one, Richard, the youngest, the loyal one, the one who had governed the North, fought the Scots, served his brother without complaint for 12 long years. The petition urged him, beseeched him on behalf of the Lords and Commons of England, to accept the throne that was rightfully his. He refused. Once, he declined, expressed reluctance, suggested he was unworthy of such a burden. He was asked again. He accepted. What moves in a man in that moment, in the breath between refusal and acceptance? Was it ambition that finally surfaced, or was it, as he maintained, duty? The acceptance of responsibility thrust upon him by circumstance, by law, by the failures and secrets of others? We cannot know what Richard of Gloucester felt in that room. We know only what he did. On the 6th of July, 1483, Richard of Gloucester was crowned King of England in Westminster Abbey. The ceremony was magnificent. A coronation is not merely a ritual. It is a statement made in silk and gold and sacred oil. He and Anne Neville rode from the Tower to Westminster in a procession through streets hung with cloth and color. In the Abbey, the Archbishop of Canterbury anointed him, placed St. Edward's crown upon his head, and invested him with the orb and scepter. Anne was crowned beside him. Together they rose from their knees as King and Queen of England. He was 30 years old, and somewhere beneath the gilded surface of that day, something else was happening. Something quieter. Something that would haunt the reign before it had properly begun. The princes in the Tower were still there. Edward V and his younger brother. Richard of Shrewsbury had been observed in the Tower Gardens in the earlier weeks of June. Witnesses noted them practicing archery, visible from the river. But as June wore into July, the sightings grew rarer. After the coronation, the boys seemed to stop being seen at all. What happened to them is one of the most debated questions in all of English history. The honest answer is that no one knows. They were in the Tower, they were under Richard's authority, and then they were simply absent. absent from records, absent from sightings, absent from the carefully maintained administrative machinery of a medieval court that kept track of almost everything. No contemporary document from Richard's reign announces their death. No funeral, no tomb, no formal statement. That silence is, in itself, a kind of answer, though not the kind that satisfies Dot in the summer and autumn of 1483, as Richard began his royal progress across England, receiving loyalty, dispensing justice, pressing the authority of his new crown into every corner of the kingdom. The silence about the princes was filling with something else. Rumor. It moved through London the way plague moved. Invisibly, street by street, carried in whispers and glances and the particular way a man falls quiet when certain names are spoken. People were saying by late summer that the boys were dead, that they had been smothered in their beds by men acting on orders. The rumors crossed the Channel. They reached the French court, where the Chancellor repeated them before the Estates General. They reached Brittany, where a Welsh exile named Henry Tudor watched events in England with patient, careful attention, calculating when the moment to move might come. The rumors spread because no one contradicted them with evidence. Richard did not produce the princes to demonstrate their safety. He did not announce their fate. He said nothing. And in that nothing, the imagination of his enemies found unlimited space to work. Who spread these rumors first? Who had the most to gain? These are questions that Richard's modern defenders ask with considerable force. Henry Tudor's claim to the throne depended on the princes being gone. The Woodville faction, disgraced, stripped of power, hungry for revenge, had every reason to paint their enemy as a child murderer. The men who would soon conspire against Richard needed a crime to justify their treason, but these questions do not entirely answer the deeper problem. The boys were in Richard's custody. The boys disappeared, and however the rumors began, Richard, a man who governed the North with demonstrable efficiency, who maintained detailed administrative records, who understood the practical mechanics of power, never found a way to dispel them. That is the shadow that falls across the reign from its first weeks onward. The coronation had been magnificent. The legal architecture of titulus regers had been careful and thorough. The ceremony at Westminster Abbey had pressed the claim into sacred oil and silk, and still, beneath all of it, the question moved through England like cold air under a door. The shadow did not lift. It deepened. It attached itself to the symbol of the white boar, Richard's own chosen emblem, worn with pride, and turned it sinister in the mouths of his enemies. The man called Good Duke Richard in the north, who had administered justice and held the border with a steady hand for 12 years, was being recast in the imagination of southern England and the courts of Europe as something else entirely. A usurper, a murderer, a king whose crown was stained. He was 31 years old, newly crowned, riding through his kingdom to show himself to his people. He had a queen beside him, and for now, a son waiting at Middleham, and the darkness was already gathering, patient and absolute. At the edges of everything he had built, rest now. Let the summer of 1483 settle into its long, uncertain silence. The river moves. The tower stands. The question breathes in the dark, as it has breathed for 5.5 centuries. Sleep. Somewhere in the outer city. In the taverns and the marketplaces and the crowded parishes of a summer London, something had already shifted. It could not be seen or measured. It could only be felt, the way a room feels different when a candle goes out, before the eyes have adjusted, before the darkness has fully declared itself. The coronation had been real. The king was real. The law of Titulus Regius was real and rolled on the parliamentary rolls for all to read. And the question was also real. It had no answer that anyone could show. It had only silence, and the silence had a shape, and the shape of it was two small boys who had played at archery in a summer garden, and then, quietly, had stopped being seen in the world. He moved. That is the first thing to understand about Richard III as king. He did not sit in Westminster and wait for the world to come to him. He moved through it, relentlessly, deliberately, with the same martial energy he had brought to the North for 12 long years. The summer of 1483 had barely settled before he was riding, through Oxford and Coventry, through York and Lincoln, through the great cathedral towns and the modest market squares, through places where people had never seen a reigning monarch stand before them in their lifetimes. What does a king do? When his crown is new and the whispers are already old, he shows himself. He makes himself real. That royal progress of 1483 was not ceremonial vanity. It was political necessity. Richard understood, with the cold pragmatism that had always defined him, that a king unseen is a king unreal, and a king unreal is a king vulnerable. He had watched the court of his brother Edward for years and seen how quickly whispers became fact in the minds of men who wished to believe them. And so he rode, with his queen, Anne Neville, beside him, with his household in train, with the pageantry of kingship displayed at every gatehouse and civic reception. From London northward through the Midlands and beyond. The crowds came out. The mayors made speeches. And in York, the city he loved above all others, the center of his life for 12 years, the reception was extraordinary, genuine and warm in a way no pageant could manufacture. The mystery plays were performed in the streets. Cloth hung from the windows. The minster bells rang. And for one brief, luminous moment, surrounded by the loyalty of the North, Richard must have allowed himself to feel something approaching certainty. But certainty, for Richard, had never been permitted to last. He was a king who governed, not merely a king who reigned, and this distinction is one of the great overlooked ironies of his story. The man whose name became synonymous with treachery was, in the brief span of his actual rule, one of the most reform-minded monarchs England had produced in a generation. He had spent 12 years inside the machinery of English governance and had seen, from the inside, how the law could be corrupted and turned against the very people it was supposed to protect. And as king, he moved to correct this. What does a man do with power when he has spent his life watching it be abused? He tries to correct it. The Parliament of 1484, the single parliament of his abbreviated reign, was where Richard left his clearest legislative mark. He introduced the right of bail for men accused of crimes but not yet tried, a protection so fundamental to basic justice that it endures in common law to the present day. Before this reform, a man could be held indefinitely on nothing more than an accusation, his property seized, his life dismantled before he ever stood before a judge. Richard ended that. He abolished benevolences. the forced loans extracted from wealthy subjects by the crown, a practice his brother Edward had employed freely, and which bred simmering resentment. He outlawed them entirely, and in a reform of remarkable practical humanity, he ordered that the laws of England, written for centuries in Latin and Norman French, impenetrable to ordinary men, be translated into plain English, into the language a farmer in Yorkshire or a tradesman in Bristol actually spoke, so that the man bound by the law could, for the first time, actually read it. These are not the acts of a tyrant. These are the acts of a man who believed in the law, who had spent 12 years applying it as firmly and evenly as he could in one of the most difficult regions of the kingdom, who thought, perhaps naively, perhaps with desperate conviction, that good governance was its own argument, that if he administered well, the darkness gathering at the edges of his reign could be held back. He was wrong, but the trying was genuine, and then came Buckingham. Henry Stafford. The second Duke of Buckingham had been Richard's single most important ally in the seizure of power. He had ridden beside him at Stony Stratford and pressed the case for the titulus regers through lords and bishops alike. Richard had rewarded him generously with titles, with vast lands, with an authority that made him the second most powerful man in the realm. What drives a man, given everything, to throw it all away? No one has ever definitively resolved this. Perhaps Buckingham felt cheated of still greater rewards. Perhaps he nursed dynastic ambitions of his own. The Staffords held Plantagenet blood, distant but real. Perhaps he simply came to believe he was serving a cause that could not survive. In the autumn of 1483, he raised his standard against the king. The plan was coordinated risings in the south and west, intended to coincide with a landing by the exiled Henry Tudor from Brittany. It was the most serious challenge Richard's reign had yet encountered. And then the weather destroyed it. The rains came with ferocity. The rivers flooded. The Severn burst its banks and swallowed the borderland roads. Tudor's ships were scattered by storms and could not land. The southern risings collapsed. Buckingham himself, his forces dissolving around him in the cold and waterlogged misery of the Welsh marshes, was betrayed by one of his own servants. He was taken, brought south, and executed at Salisbury on the 2nd day of November, 1480-3. Richard had crushed the rebellion. He was 31 years old, and he was now more completely than before alone. But nothing could prepare him for what came next. His son died. Edward of Middleham, Prince of Wales, Richard's only legitimate child, had been left at the castle that had been his home since infancy. He was a frail boy. Contemporary accounts suggest a delicacy that worried those around him. He was perhaps 9 or 10 years old in the spring of 1484 when the news reached Richard and Anne at Nottingham. The chronicles are brief and stunned. They record simply that the prince died and that his parents were overwhelmed, not the controlled grief of sovereigns who knew how to wear their sorrow as a political instrument. What the court witnessed was the undisguised anguish of two parents. Richard and Anne had known each other since childhood in the household of Warwick, had built a life together at Middleham in the quiet years when they were far from court politics. And Edward, small, fragile, beloved, had been the living proof that this life had produced something lasting. Now the succession was empty. The dynasty Richard had seized a crown to establish had no continuation. The grief did not pass. It settled into the substance of his remaining months, coloring everything that followed with a shadow that no political success could reach. Richard continued to govern. He issued writs, received delegations, and planned his defenses against the growing threat. But the brightness, if there had ever been brightness in his reign, was now extinguished. And then Anne began to die. It was slow. As tuberculosis is always low, the wasting illness the age called consumption, and it was visible and relentless. Anne Neville, Queen of England for less than 2 years, grew thinner through the autumn of 1484 and into the deep cold of the winter that followed. She was 28 and fading in a way that everyone could see and no one could prevent. What do the whispers say in a court that watches a queen die when the king has no heir? They said Richard wished her dead. They said, and the cruelty of political rumor rarely reached such depths, that he intended to marry his own niece. Elizabeth of York, eldest daughter of his dead brother, in order to deny her to Henry Tudor. The rumor spread until Richard did something unprecedented. He summoned the mayor and aldermen of London before him and denied it formally, explicitly, in terms that left no room for interpretation. That he was forced to make such a denial publicly before the civic leadership of his own capital tells you everything about the atmosphere in which his reign was now dissolving. Anne Neville died on the 16th day of March, 1485. She was 28 years old. An eclipse of the sun was visible over England on that same day. A coincidence the medieval mind, always scanning the heavens for meaning, would not have set aside lightly. And so he stood, at 32, in a kingdom that watched him with a fear it had decided to read as guilt, without a son, without a queen, without Buckingham, without the certainty that any man around him would hold firm when the testing came. Henry Tudor remained in France, gathering men, money, and the backing of the French crown. Every month that passed brought more of the uncertain and the ambitious into his camp. Richard had governed well. He had reformed the law in ways that mattered to ordinary people. He had crushed a rebellion and made himself visible and real to his subjects. And he had lost in barely 18 months his son, his queen, his closest ally, and the quiet clarity of purpose that had carried him through the worst days of his life. What remained was duty. What remained was the habit of action. What remained was the white boar, still embroidered on the livery of his household, worn by men whose inner thoughts he could no longer read with confidence. He was 32 years old. He was tired. He was grieving. And the summer of 1485 was coming. Rest now. Let the cold of that March evening settle over Nottingham Castle, where he kept his court and watched the road south. The rivers are dark. The candles have burned low. The white boar stands still. The armies will come. But not yet. Sleep. He had been waiting for this. Not with anticipation, not with the sharp hunger of a young man who believes that courage alone decides outcomes. He had been waiting the way a man waits who has seen enough to know that the worst things arrive quietly, on an ordinary morning with birds singing in the fields and no announcement from heaven to mark the hour. He was 32 years old. He had buried a son. He had buried a queen. And now, in the long summer of 1485, the waiting was over. Henry Tudor had landed. The news came to Nottingham Castle on the 11th day of August, 1485. Henry Tudor, the exiled claimant of the House of Lancaster, had come ashore at Milford Haven on the 7th day of August, on the southwestern coast of Wales, with an army at his back. His force was small at the outset, perhaps 2,000 men, many of them French mercenaries supplied by the French crown. But the army was growing. Along the roads of Wales, through the towns and valleys that remembered the Red Dragon, men were joining his march. Henry's grandfather, Owen Tudor, had been Welsh. His father, Edmund Tudor, had been Earl of Richmond. There was a story being told here, mile by mile, and it was gaining weight. What does it feel like to be a king and learn that your challenger has finally come? For Richard, it was perhaps closer to relief than fear. The months of waiting had been their own particular torture. The not knowing, the reading of men's faces for the small flicker behind the eyes that meant a man was calculating his options. Now there was a direction. Now there were roads and forces, and the old, brutal simplicity of war, which Richard understood far better than the quiet, grinding treachery of peacetime politics. He issued his summons immediately. He moved to Leicester, placing himself at the center of the country. He believed his forces would vastly outnumber the rebel army. He had the crown, the machinery of royal government, the established order of the realm. He had fought at Barnet and Tewkesbury as a teenager commanding the vanguard. He was a soldier. He was a king. But the kingdom was not responding the way a kingdom should. Lord Thomas Stanley sent word that he was ill and could not come. This was a lie transparent enough to be insulting. Stanley was one of the most powerful magnates in England, his lands stretching across the northwest, his men numbering in the thousands. His brother, Sir William Stanley, controlled further forces in North Wales. The Stanleys had spent their careers threading between factions, committing just enough to seem loyal and just little enough to remain viable. Thomas Stanley was also the husband of Margaret Beaufort, Henry Tudor's mother. Richard detained Stanley's son, Lord Strange, at court as a surety. It was the kind of move that acknowledges a danger while pretending it can be managed. On the 21st day of August, Richard rode out of Leicester at the head of his army. Those who saw him described a king in full armor, mounted on a great white horse, wearing his crown over his helmet so that every man could see exactly who led them. It was a declaration. Whatever the whispers claimed, here was the King of England riding openly to meet his challenger. In the tradition of every warrior king who had ever sat upon this throne, the armies met near the small market town of Market Bosworth on the 22nd day of August, 1485. The land rolled gently between marshy ground and open fields. Richard's army was the larger force. His artillery and archers took position. Henry Tudor's forces arrayed across the valley, and on the flanks, at a careful, ambiguous distance from both armies, sat the forces of the Stanley family, thousands of men, watching, waiting, committed to nothing. The battle began. The fighting was brutal, as battles in this century always were, not the clean affairs of later imagination, but the grinding chaos of men in heavy, armor pushing and hacking in the summer heat. Richard watched from the ridge. He could see the shape of things. He could see that the Stanleys were not moving. And then he saw. Henry Tudor. Henry had moved away from the main body of his forces, positioning himself with a small bodyguard at a point some distance from the fighting. He was exposed. He was in the brutal arithmetic of medieval warfare within reach. What drives a man to make the most audacious gamble of his life? Perhaps it was calculation. If Henry Tudor died, the rebellion died with him. The Stanleys would have no one to back. The French mercenaries would have no cause. One charge, one target, one king against another. Perhaps it was something beyond calculation. Perhaps it was the accumulated weight of everything lost. His son, his queen, his closest ally, his reputation, all of it stripped away, and somewhere beneath the pragmatic soldier, there was a man simply tired of being cautious. Richard called his household knights to him. He lowered his visor. He ordered the charge. What followed was one of the most extraordinary moments in English military history. Richard III personally led a cavalry charge directly toward Henry Tudor. His knights rode with him, the white Boar banners snapping above their heads. They smashed through Henry's outer guard. They cut down Henry's standard-bearer, Sir William Brandon. Sir John Chain, a giant of a man who interposed himself, was unhorsed. Richard got close, incredibly, terrifyingly close, and then the Stanleys moved. Sir William Stanley led his forces down into the valley and crashed into Richard's charging cavalry from the side. The impact was catastrophic. Richard's charge was overwhelmed. His horse became mired in the marshy ground. He was brought down. He did not surrender. Men who were present agreed on this. Richard III did not flee. He fought on foot in his armor, surrounded by enemies, after his charge had failed. He was struck multiple times. He died in the press of the fighting on the 22nd day of August, 1485, on a gentle hillside in Leicestershire, in the sun and the dust and the blood of a late summer morning. He was 32 years old. He was the last king of England to die in battle. His body was stripped and carried to Leicester, displayed publicly, then buried without ceremony in the choir of the Greyfriars Church. When Henry VIII dissolved the monasteries, the church was demolished. The grave was forgotten. The last Plantagenet lay in the undisturbed dark beneath rubble, and the Tudor machine began its work. Henry VII understood that his own claim to the throne was thin. It rested on a legitimized but originally illegitimate Lancaster line. What it could survive was the thorough destruction of the alternative. The titulus regius was repealed and ordered destroyed. Henry married Elizabeth of York and began carefully and systematically the vilification of the man he had defeated. Richard became the usurper, the murderer, the hunchback whose crooked body mirrored the crooked soul within. Thomas More wrote his darkly compelling history. A generation later, William Shakespeare turned the material into one of the most vivid villains in the English language. Burned into cultural memory and almost entirely divorced from the complex man who had actually lived. For 527 years, he lay beneath Leicester. Then, on the 5th day of September 2012, archaeologists working with the University of Leicester began excavating a council-owned car park in the city center. The car park occupied the site of the old Greyfriars Church. On the first day of the dig, within hours of breaking ground, they uncovered human remains. The bones showed severe scoliosis, a curvature of the spine that would have made one shoulder appear higher than the other, producing exactly the asymmetry that had been described and exaggerated in Tudor accounts. The skull showed wounds consistent with a man killed in close combat, including one devastating blow at the back of the head, delivered after the helmet had been lost or removed. The DNA was tested against living maternal line descendants of Richard's sister, Anne of York. It matched. On the 4th day of February 2013, the University of Leicester announced the results. They had found Richard III. He was given a new burial in 2015. His coffin of English oak was carried through the streets of Leicester, with an honor guard and thousands lining the route. He was reinterred in Leicester Cathedral beneath a simple stone tomb. The bells rang. The same early spring light that might have touched the Greyfriars Church 5 centuries before fell on the old stones of the city, and on the faces of people who had come to bear witness to the end of the longest wait. The questions that gather around him will never be fully resolved. Whether he ordered the deaths of the princes in the Tower cannot be answered with certainty by the historical record as it stands. The Tudor sources are compromised by political interest. The evidence is circumstantial. What the record does show is a man who governed the North with genuine effectiveness, who reformed the law in ways that protected ordinary people, who marched out to meet his challenger openly rather than hiding behind walls, and who, when his charge had failed and his allies had vanished, chose to keep fighting. The White Boar, the last Plantagenet, the king who lay in the dark beneath a car park for 5 centuries and came back, finally, to be given the ceremony his ending had denied him. Suggest topics for new videos in the comments and subscribe to the channel. Sleep Stories, Sleep Dream are released here every day.